You clicked on this video for a reason, and it's not just because Alec Baldwin's name is all over the headlines again. It's because somewhere deep down, you know something isn't adding up. You've seen the press conferences, the social media debates, the endless breaking news alerts. But tonight, we're cutting through the noise. We're going to peel back the layers, and what you'll discover is not just about one man. It's about a system that failed, a tragedy that spiraled into something darker, and a truth so twisted, it's been buried under headlines and hashtags for far too long. This is the video where you finally get the answer you've been searching for. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear has never been told like this before. And once you know, you can't unknow. Let's get real for a moment. This isn't just another Hollywood story gone wrong. This is about you and me, sitting here in a world where celebrity, power, and the media play by their own rules. Where someone can go from beloved actor to accused criminal in a blink, and then somehow, just as quickly, slide out of the spotlight again. But beneath that rapid fall and even faster recovery is a timeline full of secrets, conflicting accounts, and evidence that was almost lost forever. If you've ever questioned how much truth the public is actually allowed to see, or if you've ever wondered why certain people seem to live above the law, you're not alone. I made this video for you because I was asking the same questions. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to have answers that most people still don't. Let me pull you into the heart of this thing, because this case is more than just a legal battle or an unfortunate on-set accident. It's a psychological thriller playing out in real life. Think about it. What happens when the spotlight turns from fame to infamy? When someone who has shaped how millions of us see politics, comedy, and drama suddenly becomes the center of a criminal investigation. It doesn't just shake the entertainment world. It shakes our belief in accountability, in justice, in the idea that actions have consequences no matter who you are. And as much as the headlines try to simplify it, the truth is far messier, more human, and far more disturbing. You clicked on this because you want more than surface-level drama. You want the truth that was meant to stay buried. And that's exactly what you're going to get. Now, I'm not just going to walk you through a timeline of events because you deserve more than a recap. I want you to feel what it was like to be on that set in New Mexico. I want you to understand the tension in the air, the rushed decisions, the people who were afraid to speak up, and the one tragic moment that changed everything. We're going to step into the shoes of the key players, Alec Baldwin, the film crew, the investigators, the grieving family, and as we do, you'll start to see this wasn't just one bad decision. It was a buildup of neglect, miscommunication, and a terrifyingly casual approach to something as deadly as a firearm. But even that doesn't tell the whole story because there's something else that got missed, something that changes everything, and we'll get to that. Trust me, and I get it. You're wondering why this case, out of all the tragic events in Hollywood, has become so polarizing. Why does it keep bouncing back into the headlines? Why does it strike such a nerve with people across the country? The reason is simple, because it touches something we all feel deep down. It's about accountability, yes, but also vulnerability. It's about how quickly everything can be stripped away, even if you're rich, famous, and powerful. But it's also about how easily someone can hide behind those very things when the world stops looking. That's what makes this story so chilling. Not just what happened, but what almost didn't happen because this case was nearly closed before some brave souls stepped forward and revealed what had really been going on behind the scenes. This isn't just a mystery. It's a mirror. It reflects back to us how the justice system handles or mishandles cases where fame is involved. And it forces us to ask, if this could happen with cameras rolling, with journalists watching, with the whole world paying attention, then what happens in the cases no one talks about? That's why I'm so invested in telling this story the right way, and why I need you to stick with me through it. Because there are details you haven't heard, motives that haven't been explored, and a twist so unexpected, it flipped the entire investigation upside down. This isn't about assigning blame to one person. It's about unpacking the layers of truth, manipulation, and silence that followed a woman's tragic death. Let's talk about her for a moment, Halyna Hutchins. A rising star behind the camera, a visionary cinematographer, a mother, a wife. Her life wasn't supposed to end on a movie set. The shock of that moment, The accidental discharge of a live round is still raw. But as we dive deeper, you'll see that calling it an accident may be an oversimplification. What if there were warnings? What if there were people who knew the risks and still moved forward anyway? And what if someone, somewhere along the way, realized that this accident might be covering up something even worse? I know it sounds unbelievable, but when you hear the full story, it starts to make a terrible kind of sense. And if you're still watching, that tells me one thing. You're not just here for entertainment. You want the truth. You're someone who asks questions, who doesn't take headlines at face value. And I respect that. That's exactly why this video exists. I'm not here to push a narrative. I'm here to show you what was hidden, what was ignored, and what finally came to light thanks to the right people asking the right questions. The world saw Alec Baldwin make a statement, saw the lawsuits, saw the drama unfold in the courtroom. But what the world didn't see was the internal chaos among investigators, the sudden disappearance of crucial evidence, and the person who came forward at the very last moment, risking everything to tell the truth. Who that person is and what they knew will change the way you look at this entire case. So stay with me, because what comes next is the part no one saw coming. The part that didn't make it into the headlines. The moment when the whole investigation almost fell apart, and the shocking discovery that brought it all back to life. The twisted truth that finally exposed everything. And if you think you know this case, think again. The camera wasn't supposed to be rolling. The safety checks weren't supposed to be skipped. And Alec Baldwin wasn't supposed to pull that trigger. At least, that's what he claimed. But buried in the aftermath was a piece of footage no one was supposed to see. A piece of footage that someone tried very hard to erase, and failed. And that, my friend, is where this story truly begins. And the weeks leading up to that infamous day on the set of Rust, Alec Baldwin appeared to be enjoying a kind of second wind in his career. One that wasn't necessarily marked by blockbuster hits or critical acclaim, but by his relentless presence in the public eye. From his impression of Donald Trump on Saturday Night Live to his highly polarizing political views and unapologetic social media tirades, Baldwin had evolved from a beloved A-list actor into a divisive cultural lightning rod. Some loved him for speaking his mind. Others accused him of being arrogant, even reckless. Still, in the quieter moments off set, something about Baldwin's demeanor began to shift, and several insiders later admitted there were signs that he was under more pressure than he was letting anyone see. The production of Rust itself was troubled from the start, but despite the online noise, few could have predicted how fast his world would spin out of control. Behind the sharp humor and sarcastic tweets was a man carrying more tension than he let on. Colleagues described him as intense, sometimes abrasive, but always professional when the cameras rolled. Operating on a shoestring budget, the Western was ambitious, but chaotic. Crew members came and went, and murmurs of unsafe working conditions started surfacing as early as week 1. Complaints about long hours, skipped safety protocols, and even accidental discharges of weapons on set began making the rounds, yet no one with the power to shut things down seemed to act. Baldwin, who wasn't just the lead actor but also one of the producers, seemed caught in the middle. On one hand, he was just another performer taking direction. On the other, he held financial and creative control over the film. This dual role complicated the narrative. Was he a victim of circumstances beyond his control, or did his position give him the responsibility to step in and prevent disaster? As investigators began piecing together a timeline, new names started surfacing. One was Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, the young armorer responsible for weapons on set. Some crew members reportedly questioned her experience, claiming she was overwhelmed and out of her depth. Others insisted she was being set up as a scapegoat. Then there was Dave Halls, the assistant director who allegedly handed Baldwin the weapon and declared it a cold gun, a statement that would later become one of the most hotly contested pieces of this entire case. And yet, the deeper investigators dug, the more complicated it all became. Who actually checked the weapon? Why were live rounds anywhere near a film set? And, perhaps most haunting of all, was someone trying to send a message? It didn't take long for conspiracy theories to erupt across the internet. True crime forums, YouTube breakdowns, and TikTok detectives all began pointing fingers. Some suggested the live round had been planted intentionally. Others claimed Baldwin's political enemies were using the tragedy to destroy him. A few even went as far as to suggest Helena Hutchins was silenced for reasons unrelated to the film at all. Outlandish? Maybe. But when investigators hit roadblock after roadblock, when key witnesses suddenly stopped talking, when contradictory statements muddied the facts, and when surveillance footage mysteriously vanished, it became harder and harder to separate fact from fiction. Baldwin's relationships also began to unravel under the scrutiny. While his wife Valeria publicly stood by him, reports of tension behind closed doors began surfacing. Close friends stopped answering reporters' calls, and former co-stars gave vague, carefully worded statements when asked about the incident. One former crew member even alleged that Baldwin had a temper on set, claiming that he'd seen him explode over minor delays. Still, others painted a very different picture, a man genuinely devastated, shaken, and haunted by the outcome of a project he believed in. It was this duality that made the case so hard to pin down. Was Baldwin the villain of this story, or just the most visible face of a much deeper rot in the film industry? As more evidence was reviewed, more doubts crept in. A document leaked from the production office revealed that multiple safety complaints had been logged and ignored. Another email thread hinted that budgetary constraints led to hiring decisions that put speed over safety. But who made those calls? And more importantly, why were those records almost deleted before an anonymous whistleblower forwarded them to authorities? This mysterious figure, whose identity has still not been made public, is one of the reasons this case stayed alive. Without their intervention, critical communication threads between the production team might have disappeared forever. Their role raises even more questions. Were they acting out of conscience, or did they have a score to settle? To complicate things even further, Baldwin himself seemed to toggle between defensiveness and remorse. In one interview, he claimed he never pulled the trigger. In another, he said he didn't feel responsible for the death, despite being the one holding the gun. These statements, when played back in court and media analysis, painted a conflicting image. Some called it legal strategy. Others saw it as a man wrestling with unbearable guilt. But in the court of public opinion, Baldwin was already guilty or innocent depending on which social media bubble you lived in. Meanwhile, the people closest to Hutchins, her husband, her colleagues, her friends, were left grieving in a world that had reduced their tragedy to talking points. And then came a twist no one expected. A storage locker in Albuquerque, rented under a fake name, was discovered during a routine property check after an unpaid balance. Inside, a cache of old set footage, call sheets, unregistered props, and a hard drive that contained behind-the-scenes video never turned over to police. The locker was linked to someone affiliated with the production, but not who anyone expected. This footage, which included scenes from rehearsal and candid moments between takes, contained something that stopped investigators cold. Something that didn't line up with the official accounts given by Baldwin, Halls, or Gutierrez-Reed. The footage was quietly handed over to law enforcement, but leaked stills began circulating online, sparking even more speculation. Some claimed it proved Baldwin knew more than he let on. Others insisted it vindicated him completely. That's when the story took another dark turn. One of the original crew members, who had gone silent for months, resurfaced through a cryptic social media post, hinting that they had information that could change everything. But before they could be contacted for a formal interview, they vanished. Their phone was disconnected. Their apartment was vacated. Their online profiles were scrubbed. It was as if they had never existed. Police said there was no sign of foul play, but that only fueled more rumors. What did they know? And why were they so scared to speak? All of this, the relationships, the missed warnings, the new footage, the vanished witness, it all points to something bigger than a simple case of on-set negligence. It suggests layers of deception, fear, and silence. As the truth struggles to surface, it becomes harder to tell who's protecting whom and who might be hiding in plain sight. We haven't even scratched the surface of what this footage revealed, or how it connects to a person no one was paying attention to until now. And that's where everything shifts. Because once you see what was captured on that hard drive, you'll realize this wasn't just a tragic accident, it was something else entirely. Something planned? Something covered up? Or just a chain reaction of unchecked chaos? One frame in particular, a silent exchange between two crew members just seconds before the incident, raises a question so disturbing, it stopped even seasoned investigators in their tracks. And that one moment is what we'll unpack next, just when Alec Baldwin seemed on the verge of understanding what really happened that day on the Rust set. But days after it was quietly turned over to law enforcement, something bizarre happened. When investigators went to retrieve it for analysis, the drive had vanished from the evidence locker. It had footage no one knew existed, moments that contradicted public statements and exposed subtle tensions between key crew members. The truth began to slip through his fingers like smoke. That hard drive, the one discovered in the abandoned storage locker, was supposed to be the turning point. No record of it being checked out. No documentation. No trace. The chain of custody was broken. A security camera, which had been operating for years in the hallway leading to the evidence room, happened to be offline for maintenance during the exact window the drive disappeared. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt deliberate. Baldwin, who had been holding tightly to the hope that this drive would clear his name, or at least bring clarity, was suddenly back at square one. His legal team grew restless. The media frenzy reignited. And more troubling than all that, someone sent him an anonymous envelope with just 3 words typed on a small strip of paper. Let it go. There was no return address, no fingerprints, nothing to trace. For the first time since the tragedy, Baldwin didn't just feel under attack, he felt hunted. He told close friends he wasn't sleeping, that every noise outside his home sounded suspicious, that he started noticing the same unmarked black SUV parked across from his building, engine idling for hours without moving. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it wasn't. In the midst of all this, Baldwin reached out to a trusted colleague from early in his career, someone he'd remained close to, someone who had also worked behind the scenes in film production. We'll call him Marcus for now. Marcus offered to help, claiming he had connections in private investigation circles and could quietly look into what had really gone wrong on the Rust set without alerting anyone officially. Baldwin, desperate and running out of options, agreed. For the first few weeks, Marcus seemed like the perfect ally, calm, resourceful, and one step ahead of the curve. But then little things didn't add up. Phone calls that suddenly disconnected when Baldwin asked direct questions. Vague answers about meetings Marcus supposedly had with informants. And most curious of all, Marcus had somehow gotten access to early production footage that hadn't even been shared with law enforcement yet. When Baldwin finally confronted him, Marcus became defensive, claiming he was doing whatever it took to find the truth. But something about his tone had changed. He wasn't just helping anymore, he was steering, choosing what to share and what to keep hidden. And when Baldwin demanded full access to Marcus's research, he was met with silence, then a sharp warning. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, Alec. If you knew what I know, you'd walk away. It was a betrayal Baldwin never saw coming. The man he had confided in was now another layer of the mystery, either a gatekeeper to the truth or a key player in its concealment. At the same time, a new voice entered the picture, an anonymous blogger operating under the username SetRat. They began posting cryptic breakdowns of the Rust case on underground forums and private Discord servers, using detailed language that suggested they were either an insider or someone with access to high-level information. Each post would include screenshots of call sheets, internal crew emails, and even grainy behind-the-scenes photos never made public. Their posts were chilling, matter-of-fact, and always ended with the same ominous signature. This was never an accident. Baldwin's team tried to trace the IP address of the user, but every lead ended in a dead end. VPNs, proxies, and encrypted servers ensured their identity remained hidden. But in one post, SetRat made a reference to something only Alec and one other person would know, a phrase from a conversation that never happened on camera. That's when Baldwin realized, whoever this was, they had been there. As the puzzle pieces kept shifting, Baldwin remembered something else, a moment weeks before the incident when Helena Hutchins pulled him aside. It had seemed insignificant at the time. She mentioned offhandedly that something felt off on set and that she was starting to question certain decisions being made behind the scenes. She didn't say who or what exactly she meant. Just that there were things happening above their pay grade that didn't sit right with her. Baldwin had chalked it up to the stress of production and long days in the desert heat. Now, that memory took on new weight. What had she seen? And was it possible she had begun to document it? Baldwin wasn't the only one digging anymore. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and even former crew members began poking into the shadows of the production. And that's when an old story surfaced, one that had almost been buried. Years ago, during a different project, the same production company behind Rust had faced another serious incident involving prop weapons. It was quietly settled out of court, never made public. The similarities were too close to ignore. The same suppliers, the same cut corners, the same rush to meet impossible deadlines. Was Rust just the result of negligence repeating itself, or had someone in power chosen to ignore the past in favor of profit? Baldwin now stood at the center of a collapsing narrative. What began as a clear tragedy was now a twisted web of hidden motives, lost evidence, and people who were either too scared or too complicit to speak. The question wasn't just who loaded the gun. It was who allowed the circumstances for it to happen and why those people were still walking free. And then, just when it seemed like Baldwin had reached another dead end, his legal assistant received a message from an unfamiliar number. No text. No context. Just a short video clip. It was shaky, dark, filmed on a phone from behind some scaffolding on set. The clip was only 10 seconds long, but what it showed could blow the entire investigation wide open. It revealed a meeting. 3 individuals. Whispering. Passing something from hand to hand. One of them unmistakably Marcus. And the voice at the end of the clip? Chilling. Calm. Whispering just 3 he can't know. The moment Baldwin saw the grainy clip, everything shifted. The voice, the low, deliberate whisper saying he can't know, was burned into his mind, looping endlessly, infecting every thought, every breath. The figure caught on the edge of the frame, barely illuminated by the flicker of set lights, was unmistakably Marcus. Baldwin didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. But denial was no longer an option. The man he had trusted, the one who had promised to help uncover the truth, was now part of the very thing Baldwin was trying to expose. What was he hiding? And more importantly, why? The layers of deception were getting thicker, and Alec felt himself sinking into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. RDS. While Baldwin wrestled with this explosive new twist, another crack formed in the facade of the investigation, this time from a completely unexpected direction. Elena, a longtime friend of Helena Hutchins and a fellow cinematographer who had worked with her on smaller projects before Rust, contacted Baldwin privately. She had avoided speaking out publicly, fearing the media circus and legal blowback. But now, she had received something that forced her out of the shadows. No return address, no postage. Inside was a single USB drive and a note with handwriting she swore matched Helena's journal entries. 3 words again. They knew everything. In the early hours of the morning, an unmarked envelope appeared on her doorstep. The footage on the USB was disturbing in its implications. It contained a series of short video logs Helena had recorded privately in the weeks leading up to her death. These weren't meant for publication or production archives. These were personal, off-the-record reflections. In them, Helena expressed growing unease with how safety protocols were being ignored and corners were being cut in the name of budget and time. She mentioned having conversations with department heads who were uncomfortable with the way weapons were being handled. But more than that, she mentioned being pressured to stay quiet, to not ask too many questions. And in one particularly haunting clip, she mentioned seeing someone swap something out on the prop table when no one else was around, someone she didn't recognize as part of the official crew. This changed everything. If Helena had felt threatened enough to document her fears privately, it meant she had already suspected something sinister was happening. Baldwin immediately arranged a meeting with Elena to review the footage together and have it verified. But when she didn't show up, panic set in. Calls went unanswered. Messages unread. Hours later, she finally responded, but not with her voice. She sent Baldwin a single photo. It showed her car windows smashed in, her bag torn open, and the USB drive gone. No note. No threat this time. Just silence. Someone was watching more than just Alec now. They were circling anyone who might come close to the truth. At this point, Baldwin's legal team began considering something they had dismissed early on, that this might not just be a matter of negligence or oversight. There was a growing possibility that someone had orchestrated this with intent. And the deeper they looked, the more strange connections surfaced. A member of the prop team, who had been terminated shortly before the accident under mysterious circumstances, had since gone completely off the grid. No online presence. No forwarding address. The production company claimed he left voluntarily after a disagreement, but when reporters tried to track him down for comment, they discovered his old apartment had been cleared out overnight, as if he'd vanished into thin air. And then came a disturbing revelation. A public records search revealed he had changed his name 2 years prior, after being investigated in another state for weapons violations on a film set that had also ended in injury. That case, too, had mysteriously been dropped. The public narrative, what everyone thought they understood about the Alec Baldwin shooting, was unraveling. This wasn't just about a prop gun. This wasn't just about one tragic accident. It was starting to look like a pattern, with threads connecting people and events that had never been placed side by side until now. And as those threads tangled, one thing became increasingly clear. Somebody, somewhere, had a lot to lose if the truth came out. Tensions boiled over when a major tabloid received an anonymous tip claiming to have an exclusive witness who had been paid to keep quiet about the incident. The tabloid was ready to publish the interview, even teasing it across social media platforms. But just hours before the story went live, the witness retracted their statement, citing new information and safety concerns. No one could get a hold of them again. Their lawyer declined interviews. And when the tabloid's editor was asked why the story was pulled, she simply said, "We were advised not to move forward." Baldwin now faced an agonizing realization. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was about control, about power. There were people behind the scenes, people whose faces the public would never see, pulling strings, erasing evidence, and making sure the truth stayed buried. But every cover-up leaves cracks. And every lie, if pushed hard enough, begins to fracture. Baldwin knew the deeper he went, the more isolated he'd become. Friends were distancing themselves. Legal pressure was mounting. But there was no turning back.
Not now.
Not when every new clue pointed towards something far more organized and far more terrifying than anyone had suspected. And then came the final twist in this chapter. One of Baldwin's attorneys, a seasoned investigator in entertainment law with decades of experience, received a package addressed to his home. Inside wasn't a threat. It wasn't a clue. It was a single frame of film, an actual frame cut from the Rust dailies. It showed a wide shot of the scene before the incident. Everyone appeared in their places. Everything looked normal. But in the far background, barely visible unless enhanced, stood a shadowy figure holding what looked like a walkie-talkie, facing away from the camera. No one on the call sheet matched that silhouette. No record of any extra that day. Just a silent, blurry figure watching from the shadows. And written on the back of the film strip was a new message, scrawled in red ink. He was never supposed to be in the scene. That night, as Baldwin sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, sipping cold coffee that had gone bitter with time, he heard it, the unmistakable crunch of gravel under cautious footsteps outside his window. It was subtle, almost nothing. But when your life has become a careful game of decoding every glance, every whisper, every creak in the night, even the smallest sound turns into a threat. He froze, his breath shallow, pulse spiking. He didn't move toward the window.
He knew better than that.
Instead, he backed into the darker part of the kitchen, heart thudding like a drum in his ears. The security lights didn't flicker on. Nothing else stirred. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the sound stopped. Silence crept in like a fog, thick and heavy with implication. Baldwin waited 10 minutes before checking the cameras on his phone. Footage glitched. Nothing recorded between 2:14 and 2:20 a.m. It was a 6-minute blackout in an otherwise flawless stream. That wasn't coincidence. That was intentional. By morning, he was already spiraling. Had someone really been there? Was he imagining it? Had the pressure finally cracked something inside him? The truth was, he hadn't slept more than a couple hours in weeks. Every message felt like code. Every email could be a plant. The line between paranoia and reality had begun to blur in ways that were hard to admit, even to himself. But the universe gave him no time to rest. Just after sunrise, he received a call from his assistant, frantic and barely coherent. Gina, his longtime confidant, the one person who had stood by him when everyone else kept their distance, was missing. Her phone was off. She hadn't returned home. Her car was still parked at the studio lot. Security footage showed her walking out with her bag slung over her shoulder, keys in hand. But there was no sign of her after that. No calls. No credit card activity. Nothing.
Just gone.
Panic wrapped around Baldwin like a vice. Gina wasn't just an assistant. She knew everything. Every conversation, every new piece of evidence, every secret meeting, every theory they had considered and dismissed. She had backed up every video, logged every email, cataloged every suspicious lead. And now she had vanished, with no trace and no reason. It felt targeted. Too precise to be coincidence. Baldwin didn't want to say it out loud, but the thought hung there, unspoken. Was she taken? The fear was no longer abstract. This wasn't just about career damage or media narratives. This was physical, real, dangerous. And the worst part was the isolation. The world still saw him as the actor under investigation, as the man who had held the gun, as the central figure in a case wrapped in scandal and speculation. Few believed he was now being hunted, not by the law, but by something darker. Something that had no interest in justice or truth. Something that wanted to silence.
Permanently.
He started to look over his shoulder in public. The same black sedan showed up more than once at the coffee shop down the street, always parked facing outward, engine running. Strangers seemed to linger longer than they should at restaurant counters or hallways near his office. Even at home, there were signs. Doors unlocked that he knew he had bolted, drawers left slightly ajar, lights flickering just once before returning to normal. It felt like a psychological war, designed to disorient him, to make him question what was real and what was imagined. And it was working. His nerves were frayed, his patience worn thin, his sense of reality eroding. The worst blow came when he received a package at his home without any delivery records. No signature. No tracking ID. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, like it had been pulled from an old surveillance camera. It was of Gina. She was seated at a diner booth, smiling faintly, a cup of coffee in her hands. The timestamp on the photo was dated 2 days after she had disappeared. Scrawled on the back, in the same red ink as the film strip before, were 5 words. "You're next if you talk." Baldwin didn't know whether to take it as a threat or a clue. Was she alive and being watched? Or was this staged to send a message? Every question only spiraled into 10 more. He forwarded the photo to a private investigator, someone he trusted outside the Hollywood bubble. But hours later, that same investigator called to say the photo had disappeared from their encrypted email thread. Deleted. Wiped clean. And his personal computer had been remotely accessed by an unknown IP address minutes after the file was opened. Baldwin was no stranger to cybercrime headlines, but now it wasn't abstract. This was calculated, coordinated, and relentless. Worse still, someone had accessed Baldwin's cloud backups. Footage, emails, even personal journals were suddenly corrupted, files were named or replaced with gibberish. Years of documentation, thoughts, and records gone. And then came the text. An anonymous number, no name, no location. Just a message. Stop. You have one chance. It wasn't a warning. It was a deadline. Now, Baldwin had to make an impossible decision. Pull back and abandon the trail entirely, or press forward knowing he was now walking a line between uncovering a buried truth and triggering something far more dangerous. Every move he made from this point forward would be watched, anticipated, possibly even manipulated. There were people out there who were determined to make sure the truth never saw daylight. And as the weight of Gina's disappearance, the missing footage, and the threats all closed in, Baldwin felt something inside him snap, not with fear, but with resolve. Because if they were this afraid of the truth coming out, then that meant the truth mattered. And that made it worth everything. But just as he began to plan his next move, his phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. This time, a link to a live stream. He tapped it with trembling fingers, expecting another cryptic taunt. Instead, the screen loaded with a familiar face. Gina, tied to a chair. And behind her, someone stepped into the frame, wearing a rust crew jacket. Alec Baldwin stood frozen, eyes glued to the screen as the grainy live stream continued to flicker. Gina didn't say a word, but her eyes told the whole story, wide, terrified, darting towards something off-screen. The man behind her wore a neutral expression, but the detail that twisted Baldwin's gut was the jacket. The logo on the chest confirmed what he feared. It was from the Rust film set. Not a replica. Not a costume. It was the real thing, worn, faded, with the stitching torn just slightly at the right cuff.
He remembered that jacket.
He had seen it before. And not just in passing, not on a stranger in a crowd. That exact jacket had once belonged to someone Baldwin had spoken to dozens of times. Someone he'd confided in during the chaos. Someone who had stood with him in the weeks following the tragedy, always just outside the spotlight. Always helpful. Always calm. It belonged to one of the producers, Reed Halpern. A quiet man with years of industry experience, someone who knew how to navigate media storms and legal chaos. Reed had been there when Baldwin gave his first public statement. He helped coordinate with legal teams. He even offered to manage press inquiries when the investigation reached its peak. But suddenly nothing made sense. Reed had vanished 2 months ago, supposedly on an extended trip overseas. No one thought much of it. In Hollywood, people disappeared all the time for projects or personal drama. But now, here he was, standing behind Gina in a hidden live stream, not masked, not hiding, just standing there like he wanted Baldwin to know. Like it was personal. The camera cut off mid-frame, leaving Baldwin reeling. For hours, he sat staring at the blank screen, replaying every interaction he ever had with Reed. Something didn't add up. Why would Reed, a respected name in the business, be tied to Gina's disappearance? What did he want? Was this blackmail, revenge, or something else entirely? And then it hit him. Reed was the one who pushed Baldwin to delete the raw on-set footage the week after the incident. He had called it a liability, insisted the legal teams had enough material. Baldwin hadn't questioned it then, numb from grief and pressure. But now, in hindsight, it was like a switch had flipped. What if the truth about that day wasn't buried by accident? What if it was carefully erased? He tore through his home office, digging through old hard drives, backups, any trace that might have survived. That's when he stumbled upon something strange, an unlabeled drive inside an envelope, postmarked the week after the shooting. He had never noticed it before, tucked deep behind a stack of tax folders. Inside were several clips from the set, none of which had ever been seen by police or lawyers. These weren't from the official cameras. They were from a handheld, probably filmed by someone off-duty. Shaky, but clear enough. And there, in one frame, Baldwin caught a glimpse of something that made his skin crawl. A private conversation between Reed and another crew member, held away from the others. No sound, but the body language was unmistakable. Tension, urgency, a piece of paper being passed between them. Baldwin paused the frame, zoomed in. The man with Reed was a technician who'd been let go quietly after the incident. The studio had claimed it was due to budgetary constraints, but now that explanation felt suspiciously thin. Baldwin remembered the guy's name, Wesley. Quiet, always keeping to himself, barely noticeable on set. He hadn't come up in the investigation. No press, no interviews, no questions. Like he was invisible. Or made to be. Baldwin ran a search for Wesley and came up with almost nothing. No current address. No social media. No recent employment. It was as if he'd been scrubbed.
Smiling.
And then, a detail resurfaced from deep in Baldwin's memory. On the last day of filming, Wesley had been the last person in the prop truck before the gun was handed over. No one ever thought to connect him directly to the weapon, and the timeline had always been blurry. But what if that was intentional? Baldwin's hands trembled as he scrolled through his notes, timelines, text messages. Everything pointed in a different direction now. It was never just an accident. The safety protocols didn't just fail, they were sabotaged. The question that now haunted him wasn't just who had pulled the strings, but why. And who else knew? Then came the final blow. As he cross-referenced old emails, one caught his eye, buried in his inbox, never opened. It was from Gina, time-stamped just 3 days before she vanished. The subject line: "Don't trust anyone." Inside was a single attachment, a compressed folder titled Halpern Insurance. He clicked. Password protected. 3 attempts left. And somewhere deep down, Baldwin realized that the answers were now within reach, but unlocking them might unravel something far darker than anyone was prepared to face. Because if this folder truly held what Gina believed it did, then Reed Halpern wasn't acting alone. This wasn't a cover-up, it was a conspiracy. And Baldwin was no longer just a suspect. He was the target. Alec Baldwin didn't sleep that night. The weight of that unopened folder, taunting him behind a password prompt, ate away at him like a slow poison. The room felt smaller, colder, like the walls were listening. He replayed Gina's last known moments again and again in his head. The fear in her voice, the urgency in her warning. Don't trust anyone. That message echoed louder than anything. And now, with Reed Halpern possibly orchestrating this twisted chain of events, Baldwin was left staring into a pit of uncertainty that stretched deeper than he ever imagined. But what truly shattered him wasn't the possibility of Reed's betrayal. It was the growing suspicion that someone even closer had been part of it all along. The moment the thought crossed his mind, his stomach turned. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There had always been one person he leaned on during the chaos, his longtime friend and attorney, Jordan Fields. Jordan had been in Alec's corner since the earliest accusations surfaced. He'd handled the press, the court dates, the PR strategy. He'd even told Alec not to respond to Gina's email directly, claiming it was likely a trap set by trolls or someone trying to manipulate public opinion. At the time, Alec believed him. Jordan had always been the voice of reason, the buffer between Alec and the world that now saw him as a villain. But suddenly, that blind trust didn't feel so safe anymore. Alec met with Jordan under the pretense of legal updates. They sat in the corner booth of a quiet restaurant in West Hollywood, just the two of them like old times. Jordan was relaxed, casual, sipping an espresso and scanning a set of documents with a pen tucked behind his ear. But Baldwin couldn't focus. His hands were clammy, his pulse was racing. Every sentence that came out of Jordan's mouth now sounded rehearsed, measured, like he was walking on a tightrope of carefully crafted words. And when Baldwin brought up Reed, Jordan's reaction was far too subdued. No shock, no anger, just a quiet nod and a muttered, "You should stay away from this." That was the moment Baldwin knew. Jordan wasn't just trying to protect him, he was protecting something else. Something buried. Something dangerous. "I need to see what's in that folder," Alec said, eyes locked on Jordan's. "Gina sent it for a reason. And if Reed's in it, I need to know who else is." Jordan hesitated for just a second too long. "That folder could destroy more than your career, Alec. You're already barely holding the pieces together. You open that and you don't come back from it. Trust me." But Baldwin didn't trust him anymore. He left the meeting with his head spinning, unable to shake the feeling that the people closest to him weren't just keeping secrets, they were actively steering him away from the truth. That night, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was the cover of the folder, clearly open. Below it, a second photo showed a familiar face, his brother Stephen Baldwin, meeting with Reed Halpern outside a gated studio lot. The timestamp? 2 weeks before Gina disappeared. Alex stared at the screen, numb. His own brother? That couldn't be right. But the image was clear, and the implications were suffocating. Why would Stephen be talking to Reed? And, more importantly, why hadn't he said a word about it? Alec called him immediately, but the line rang and rang until it went to voicemail. The second call, same thing. Third, straight to voicemail. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Reed. Or Jordan. This thing ran deeper. Alec realized he wasn't just chasing answers anymore. He was being baited into a trap, forced to choose between the people he loved and the secrets they might be hiding. That night, another message came through. This one had words. Open the folder and everything falls. Walk away and you walk free. Final warning. Alec's heart pounded as he stared at the screen. It was no longer about his name or the media frenzy or clearing his public image. It was about the lives caught in the storm, Gina, maybe Stephen, maybe even himself. Every decision now carried weight, risk, consequences. If he exposed what was in that folder, he could be destroying people he once trusted with his life. But if he backed away now, he'd be condemning Gina's warning to the void and letting whoever was pulling the strings get away with everything. He was trapped between truth and safety, between justice and betrayal. And with every passing second, the stakes only grew heavier. Alec Baldwin had played many roles in his life, but this one, the one where every move could tear his world apart, felt the most real. And just as he thought he had hit rock bottom, a final twist landed like a gut punch. The drive that once held the folder? It was gone. Stolen. Someone had been inside his home. And they had taken the only leverage he had left. He wasn't just part of the story anymore. He was being hunted by it. You said. Panic had given way to resolve. Alec Baldwin stood in the center of his once trusted world, now shattered, trying to pick up the pieces while the clock ticked louder in his ears. Someone had broken into his house, bypassed the security system, and taken the only copy of Gina's folder. That wasn't a random threat, that was precision. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to silence him. They were 10 steps ahead, erasing every breadcrumb, every connection, every piece of evidence before it could be used against them. The conspiracy wasn't just real, it was sprawling, cold, and calculated. And as Baldwin began mapping out the people involved, a terrifying picture started to form, one that left him breathless. He went back through everything, texts, emails, calendar invites, conversations he once thought innocent. Reed Halpern had been the first piece, the face of the production that spiraled into tragedy, but he wasn't the mastermind. Baldwin could feel it now. Reed was a puppet, too brash, too sloppy to orchestrate something this precise. The real operators were the ones who stayed in the background, kept their names clean, never let their fingerprints touch the mess. Baldwin started asking questions, quietly, cautiously. He reached out to Gina's sister, someone who had gone silent for months, maybe out of fear or heartbreak. What she revealed made Alec's blood run cold. Before she vanished, Gina had uncovered a chain of financial transactions tied to the production, money moving between shell companies, rerouted through offshore accounts, then finding its way back into the pockets of high-level executives. Names Alec never expected to see surfaced: studio heads, legal advisors, even a high-profile media fixer who had previously worked with Alec during his peak. People who had everything to lose if Gina's documents came to light. But there was something even more sinister beneath the money trail. There were NDAs, threats, sealed settlement records from other productions where similar accidents had occurred. Gina had been connecting the dots, and her research suggested that what happened on Alec's set wasn't a one-time tragedy. It was part of a repeated pattern, hidden in plain sight under Hollywood's polished exterior. The deeper Alec dug, the more he realized how insulated and protected the inner circle was. This wasn't just about reputation or public image, it was about power. And anyone who dared challenge it disappeared, got discredited, or was forced into silence. Gina had gotten too close, and now Alec was dangerously close to doing the same. The messages, the break-in, the pressure, it was all designed to break him down, to convince him that giving up was the only option. But the moment that truly crushed him was when he discovered the full extent of Jordan Field's betrayal. Alec had suspected something was off, but it wasn't until he traced a private bank transaction from Jordan's firm to a media black ops group that it all snapped into focus. Jordan had been feeding information to the opposition, controlling Alec's responses, steering him away from damaging leads, and even helping orchestrate leaks that portrayed Alec as unstable and obsessed. He wasn't just a bad friend. He was a handler, assigned to keep Alec from blowing the whole operation wide open. And then, in the middle of the night, Baldwin received an untraceable call. A distorted voice told him, with terrifying calm, that he wasn't the only one being watched. His children's schedules were assigned to him, down to the minute. School drop-offs, weekend activities, phone numbers of their babysitters. It was no longer about shutting Alec up, it was about total compliance. Stay quiet, walk away, or risk everything. The message was clear. The truth wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. At this point, Alec had no one left. Stephen was unreachable.
Gina was gone.
Jordan had turned. And every person he turned to for help seemed to suddenly stop replying or went cold after a single meeting. But one final piece of information gave him a sliver of hope, a name buried in one of Gina's early notes. A young intern named Maya, who worked briefly with the production before vanishing from the scene completely. Rumors claimed she had fled the country, but there were whispers, through private online forums and encrypted chat groups, that she had kept her own copy of the documents Gina compiled. Baldwin knew she was his last chance. If he could find her, maybe he could finally expose the entire machine. But he wasn't the only one looking for her, because someone else had already found out her location. And they were getting there first. The air was sharp and heavy as Alec Baldwin stepped into the dimly lit underground garage in downtown Los Angeles, the low hum of fluorescent lights above him casting eerie shadows across the cracked concrete floor. He was sweating beneath his jacket, not from heat, but from the weight of what he was about to do. For weeks, he'd been chasing pieces of a puzzle that seemed intentionally designed to drive him insane, fragmented memories, shifting alliances, threats, and betrayals. And now, finally, every trail, every whisper, every coded message had brought him here. This was it. The confrontation he'd tried to avoid, yet somehow always knew was inevitable. The entire twisted conspiracy was about to unfold right in front of him, and he wasn't sure if he was going to survive it. At the far end of the garage, parked beside a blacked-out SUV, stood Reed Halpern. He looked older, his once slick Hollywood bravado now frayed at the edges. But he wasn't alone. Jordan Fields was there too, standing in a dark coat, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind them stood a third figure, someone Baldwin didn't immediately recognize, until they stepped forward into the pale light and his heart nearly stopped. It was Victoria Lang, the former studio executive who'd publicly distanced herself from the Rust tragedy, whose name had never appeared in any official paperwork. Her presence here confirmed everything Alec feared. She wasn't just involved, she was orchestrating it. The perfect ghost in the machine, the architect of silence. Baldwin didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, watching their faces, seeing if any of them would crack first. But it was Victoria who broke it, her voice smooth, almost maternal, as if she were speaking to a troubled actor who'd gone off script. She told him there were things he wasn't meant to see. That the entertainment industry was no different than politics or corporate warfare. Power was never clean, and those who held it did so by controlling the story. Gina had stepped outside the narrative. She was writing her own. That couldn't be allowed. Alec, she explained, was always supposed to be the fall guy, famous enough to draw attention, reckless enough to believe he could fix things, but ultimately disposable if he made the wrong move. What Victoria didn't expect, however, was Maya. The intern Gina had once mentored had reemerged in a last-minute blaze of courage, reaching out to Alec with a burner phone, an encrypted drive that contained everything: the financial trails, the insurance fraud, the ghost employees, and the internal memos detailing the calculated risks that led to accidents, like the one on Alec's set. Maya had been hiding in Mexico under a new identity, but she'd come back because she knew Baldwin was the only person with enough reach and enough rage to blow the doors off the entire operation. As Victoria moved toward Alec, she tried to appeal to his ego. She said they could make it go away, that his career could be salvaged, his family protected, the public turned in his favor again. All he had to do was hand over the drive. But Alec wasn't here for negotiations anymore. He was here to end it. He pulled out a hidden recorder he'd been using during their entire conversation, already live-streaming to a secure network hosted by a coalition of independent journalists who had been tracking Hollywood corruption for years. The information had already been uploaded, the story breaking in real time.
There was no way to stop it now.
Chaos erupted. Hedy tried to run, but sirens could already be heard echoing through the garage, growing louder. Our Jordan reached for Alec, pleading that he didn't know the full extent of what was happening, that he was being used just like him. But Alec could see through it now. He'd been manipulated, gaslit, used as a smokescreen, and nearly destroyed, all in the name of image control and greed. As the LAPD swarmed the scene, Alec stood motionless, hands raised, watching Victoria's expression twist from confident control to bitter fury as her world crumbled around her. But just when it seemed the nightmare was over, and Alec could finally breathe, one final twist cut through the noise. As officers took Victoria into custody, a man in a gray suit approached Alec. He flashed a badge, not LAPD, not federal, but something far more cryptic, DHS Counterintelligence Division. He whispered in Alec's ear that this case had ties to a broader network, one that reached into foreign financing, global media manipulation, and national security. Baldwin wasn't just a witness anymore. He was now a liability in an operation much bigger than he imagined. The agent handed him a sealed envelope and warned him not to speak to anyone until he read what was inside. When Alec opened the envelope in the back of a police cruiser, what he found wasn't just another twist. It was a name, someone he trusted completely, someone who had stayed out of the chaos, someone he never even suspected. And below the name, a surveillance photo. That person, seated across from a foreign operative, smiling. The truth Alec thought he uncovered? It was only the beginning. The wind whispered through the tall eucalyptus trees lining the Malibu coast as Alec Baldwin stood alone on the cliff's edge, the Pacific stretching endlessly before him, waves crashing far below in rhythmic defiance of everything that had transpired. It had been 3 months since the night in the underground garage, 3 months of legal chaos, headlines, death threats, silence, and a truth that the world barely knew how to digest. The live stream had set off a media wildfire, exposing the hidden mechanics of an industry built on illusions and sacrifice. Names had been named, arrests made, careers ended. But despite the courtroom victories and viral outrage, Baldwin knew there were chapters of this story that would never make it to the screen. The sealed file from the Department of Homeland Security had confirmed that the conspiracy reached into places far beyond film sets and talent agencies. This wasn't just about one tragic shooting or even about power and money. It was about control of narratives, of perception, of public consciousness. The true puppet masters operated in shadow, and those shadows were still moving. He thought often about Maya, how she risked everything to speak up when she could have stayed silent. She was now in witness protection, her testimony critical in securing convictions against Victoria Lang, Reed Halpern, and a slew of unnamed co-conspirators. But her eyes, when they last spoke through a secured video line, carried something deeper than relief. They carried the same burden Alec now carried, the knowledge that some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And Gina, her memory had been dragged through the mud, distorted by headlines and industry spin until the truth finally surfaced. She had been trying to stop a cover-up. She wasn't a careless crew member. She was a whistleblower. The world now knew that, but it hadn't brought her back. And that's what haunted Baldwin the most. Justice had come, but not before damage was done that could never be undone. He remembered the photograph in that final envelope. The face of someone he'd trusted implicitly, someone who had comforted him during his darkest hours, who had encouraged him to speak out while secretly feeding information to foreign operatives trying to manipulate the fallout for geopolitical gain. That betrayal was the hardest to swallow, not because of its depth, but because of how subtle and well-played it had been. Baldwin had given so much of his life to an industry that demanded everything and gave back only when it served its own image. Now, for the first time in years, he wasn't acting. He wasn't reading lines or playing to a camera. He was simply existing, raw, exhausted, but real. The department's warning stayed with him. He had gone public with the corruption, but that didn't mean he was safe. There were forces still watching, still calculating. Every time he stepped out in public or received an unmarked package, he wondered if he was being reminded of how close he'd come to unraveling something bigger than even the justice system could contain. But in those quiet moments, when the world faded and the sound of the ocean took over, Alec found a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of understanding, of finally seeing behind the curtain and knowing exactly what was there. The industry tried to bounce back, of course. PR teams rebranded, new projects launched, and studios issued sanitized statements filled with corporate empathy and legally approved remorse. But for many in the inner circles of Hollywood, something had changed forever. A seed had been planted, an awareness, a crack in the illusion, and it was growing. People whispered more now. Interns kept journals. Anonymous tips flowed like never before. The silence that had once suffocated victims and buried secrets was beginning to lose its grip. Alec had become something he never expected, a symbol, not of guilt or scandal, but of transformation, of refusing to be buried by a machine that thrived on erasure. As he turned from the edge of the cliff and walked back toward his car, the sky bleeding orange behind him, Alec knew the world hadn't ended. But a certain chapter had. One that left scars, yes, but also opened doors to a new kind of story, one he hoped others would be brave enough to tell. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real ending. Not a wrapped-up mystery, not a heroic redemption, but a shift, a wake-up call for an audience that had finally seen beyond the screen. And somewhere, deep in the quiet rumble of the waves below, was the echo of a voice that had once screamed to be heard. Gina's voice, telling the truth, waiting for the world to finally listen.